In the name of God who was and is to come. Amen. Please be seated. So who here thinks they just heard a scary story? Who here wrestles with saying the gospel of the good news of Jesus? Praise to you, Jesus, for those stories. You can be honest. That's the great thing about inheriting the tradition of Jesus. You get to complain to God. When I sat down to try to figure out what am I going to say about this parable, I thought, all those pat answers I grew up with, this always seemed to fall flat. Has anyone ever had someone say, well, there's got to be one right interpretation of this parable, and if we can just figure it out, we'll know exactly what Jesus was saying? Did you ever hear that growing up? Well, I did. That's why I pulled out this book by one of my favorite academics, Amy Jill Levine. She's a professor at Vanderbilt Divinity School. She's a Yankee feminist Orthodox Jewish woman, is how she describes herself, who teaches New Testament at Vanderbilt Divinity School. I was shocked the first time I heard that. I'm like, what? And then the more I learned about things, the more I realized that actually makes perfect sense. We need to understand better our Jewish roots in order to understand what was going on in the New Testament. So anyhow, this book is called Short Stories by Jesus, and I recommend it to anyone who wants to dive in more to the parables. Now, of course, the one parable that she doesn't address is the one that is today's reading. If I'd been preaching last Sunday, I would have had an entire chapter on the parable of the 10 bridesmaids. Oh well. I looked in the back of here and read some of her concepts of the importance of parables, one of which is the power of disturbing stories. Now, I would say this is one of the more disturbing stories that Jesus brings up, and it's hard to wrestle with. So, you heard me preach a long time ago, and you may not remember it, or you may remember it, but there are two main kinds of stories that we tell. We have myth and parable. Now, mythic stories are stories that give us a framework for how to live our lives. Fairy tales, fables, moralistic stories. Who here has ever heard of Aesop's fables? Mm-hmm. So, did Aesop's fables generally give us a basic, this is how you ought to live your life? Yeah, that's a mythic story. Who here, Actually, who here has seen Moana? Okay. In Noisy Mass, we were trying to figure out what to make of parables. And I'm going to come back to Moana in a minute, because there's a bit of a parable in that story, as well as a myth. But I digress. The fact is, parables are not meant to have an easy, clean-cut definition. They're to make us think. So, bear with me, and this is going to be another interactive Q&A session. So, in this parable, who are the characters? Landlord? Who else? 3 slaves. Okay. Who is the good guy?
Yeah, really.
I hear the slaves with 2 and 5 talents. Who else? The what? It's hard to hear. I hear a lot of different answers at once. Speak up. Does anyone think the master was a good guy? Nope. Okay. Who thinks the slave with the 1 talent was the good guy? Okay. I do too. So, Mark, why were the guys with the 5 and 2 talents the good guys in the story, or the good persons? Success. Okay. And so no one thinks that the master is the good guy in the story, which is interesting because the interpretation I grew up with was that the reason why the master cast out the 1 talent slave was because they refused to use the talents that they were given. I find it fascinating that no one thinks that. I personally agree, but that's simply my viewpoint as a human being, not as a priest. Now, why is the gentleman with the 1 talent who hid it in the ground the good guy? Ned?
It says that in the beginning that he gave the property owner gave each according to his ability.
Mm-hmm.
And this guy was going on a protocol of his ability, so he used his ability to save what he was given.
Right.
That was probably as best as he could do, is the way I interpret it.
So he was doing the best he could do because he was the one with the least amount of abilities among the three servants, and he was doing, and his focus was saving. Now, Barbara. He was happy with what he had. Good perspective. Anyone else? Okay. What if the two slaves that made more money had lost on their investments? How do you think they would have been treated by the master? Cut him off? Mm-hmm. How would the 1 talent slave have looked if they had lost all his money and he had saved that 1 talent? He'd be sitting a lot prettier at that point, wouldn't he? So, is there really a good guy in this story? Or who's the bad guy? Anybody want to hazard a guess on who the bad guy is? The landowner? Why is the landowner the bad guy?
Well, he's punitive and he's, attacking the slave because he was afraid. His slave was afraid. That was why he took it out.
Mm-hmm.
He's a victim.
So he was harsh and he was victimizing and punitive because the slave didn't do what he wanted him to do. You know?
If this is a Jewish story, I'm having a problem with it because I thought usury was against the code.
That's an interesting point to be brought up. That usury, charging interest on things, is against the Torah. So the question is, are we assuming that the master is a Jew? We're assuming that, but is that necessarily the case?
Terrible by a Jew,
That doesn't necessarily mean that the characters were Jews.
but he didn't elaborate.
He didn't elaborate. And why do you think he didn't elaborate?
So our own assumptions into the Torah.
Mm-hmm. When you hear once upon a time, what do you expect to hear next?
They're far off.
Yes. There lived a prince or a princess or something like that. And they lived happily ever after. This is where I bring in the story of Moana. Those of you who have not seen the movie, this is a spoiler alert, I apologize. But what's interesting is that normally in Disney movies, the villain is the villain in the story. The Pacific Islander mythology is that Te-Fiti is the goddess of the ocean, and she provides life for the whole world. But Te-Ka is the goddess of death, who destroys things, like the lava goddess, basically. What's interesting is that Te-Fiti had disappeared because someone had taken her heart, which is a stone that gives life. And Moana and, what's his name? Maui had to go and find the heart and give it back because Maui had taken it. Now, what's interesting is when they go to Te-Ka to defeat her, what they have to do is put the heart back into Te-Fiti, who is the island that gives life. What's interesting is that Te-Ka begins to solidify and then changes and becomes Te-Fiti. So the very source of all that is, because we had taken away from her what was hers, had become the destructor of all that is. The bad guy, or the bad person in the story, is actually a good person. So it kind of threw that wrench and surprised me when I saw that, which I thought was kind of neat. I also like the fact that it was one of the first Disney movie where the protagonist is a female who does it on her own, doesn't have to depend on the knight in shining armor to have it happen, which is also parabolic for fairy tales. Anyhow, do you feel more or less confused about the parable after the questions that I've asked? More, okay? Why is that?
Well, our assumptions are what they are.
Mm-hmm. Parables tend to challenge our assumptions, don't they? The parable of the Good Samaritan has been so smoothed over the centuries in Christianity. But to say the Good Samaritan parable now would be like saying the American soldier went by the person on the sidelines. Then the Egyptian soldier went by, but the ISIS member gave compassion. It's that sort of, it makes you squirm, it makes you uncomfortable. It's not a pleasant story, but you're assuming that the person who's going to help is going to be someone that you approve of. And that's the challenging point. Who are we in the story? And back to the parable of the talents, where do we find ourselves? Who do we identify with? The narrator? Nicely played. I identify with the one-talent person. Much of my life, I've been afraid to take too many risks because life is not easy.
I feel the same when it comes to the prodigal son. I sort of identify with the guy who's left behind doing all the work.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the same in this one.
Mm-hmm.
The guy who's trying his best but has limited.
Mm-hmm.
He's chastised.
Mm-hmm. You identify with the prodigal son's older brother. I kind of feel the same way. It's like, are you serious, Dad? This guy runs off and squanders half of our inheritance, and he comes back, and you throw this party for him? I've asked you for this 1,000 times. I've been here doing what I'm supposed to do. I think there's validity in sympathizing with the older brother. But is the older brother without fault? And the person with one talent, we don't know. Was he told by his master to go invest that money? We don't know. But at the same time, he was playing it safe, which makes sense.
Well, some parables are aimed at forgiveness. Some are like this one you're preaching on today. Really are not.
Or maybe it's a cautionary tale.
Yeah.
Maybe it's instead of criticizing the slaves with the talents, perhaps it's about criticizing the harsh master who has no compassion. Because as you said, all the parables are about how to be in a relationship. So what is the cautionary tale we're learning from this about relationships? Is there even one answer to that question? So, the nation of Israel is from where we get our parables. Does anyone know what Israel means in Hebrew? It means wrestles with God. Isn't that interesting? The name of the people of God from which Jesus comes and through which we get our covenant are the people whose entire identity is wrestling with God. Therefore, perhaps the reason why the parables are so effective is because they force us to wrestle and continue to strive. Now, and you brought up a good point that each of us have different assumptions. We have different interpretations of this parable, and all of them have validity. What does that say about how we are in relationship with one another? Dicey? Maybe. What?
Assumptions vary
Mm-hmm.
considerably.
But does it also bring out of us when we examine this, we begin to see what our assumptions are, instead of assuming that my assumptions and your assumptions are one and the same? How does that help? How does looking at our assumptions and checking our assumptions help us in relationships? She's got a good point. It's a human whale, and she's very articulate. Perhaps it means that checking our assumptions, naming our assumptions, and looking at it from a story helps us begin to better understand where each other is coming from, and better understand that life does not have quick and easy answers. Life has lots of questions. and that perhaps the ministry of Jesus was not to give us answers, but to help us ask the right questions so that we strive in our relationships with the questions, to continue to examine our own lives, our own assumptions, our own perspectives, and learn from one another. Because Tom, the older brother needed to learn compassion from his father, and the younger brother needed to learn faithfulness from his older brother. The one slave who was afraid to invest money would do well to learn to take more risks in life, which is easy to avoid when we're afraid of life. When we're in the place of fear, where fear dominates, we don't take risks. But when we choose to step out and trust that maybe this will work, we might actually double what we have. Both of which are valid ways of looking at a situation. And instead of casting the slave out into outer darkness, perhaps giving them a second chance and coaching them would have been the better approach. So perhaps those of us who are in charge of people or that have power over people need to learn to empower the people in our charge rather than take that power from them. All this in one little story. And so what I love about this is it reminds us that our tradition, the Anglican tradition, is one where questions are often more important than the answers that we are given. And that for every answer we give, 10 more questions can arise. And that is faithful to the tradition that Jesus has passed down and was passed down to him. Anyone seen The Fiddler on the Roof? Good. You know, on the one hand, on the other hand, if you've ever seen rabbis argue, you'll know that there's more than one way to interpret Torah. So for us, the gift that we get with parables is not a quick, easy doctrinal answer that tells us exactly what to do. Like life, they are stories that continue to make us have to think, have to examine our assumptions, and throw us into the ambiguity that life gives us. And go, hey, how can I be in relationship with the person next to me who might have different perspectives than me? And also, if there is no right answer, there is no wrong answer, but we continue to have to wrestle with it, which is in the very name of the people of Jesus. So as we move forward, what are the parables that life is giving us that we have to wrestle with? What are the parables of our community at St. Paul's? And what are these parables giving us opportunity to grow into? And what horizons are we expanding into as we wrestle with our parables? May the mystery of God continue to lead us as we analyze and engage with one another, both in our sacred stories as well as our own personal stories, which are also sacred. May we continue to live into that parabolic nature of God, which is the mystery of the Christ who died and rose again, the mystery of baptism, the mystery of the Eucharist. And may we continue to live out our Anglican lives through wrestling with the questions in community. Amen.